I never thought my life would unravel like this. Never. I was a simple man, content with the quiet rhythm of our days in the small village nestled between rolling hills and dense woods. My name is Elias, and for years, I believed I had everything a man could want: a modest home, enough food on the table, and most importantly, Clara, my wife. Clara. Just thinking her name now feels like swallowing shards of glass. Back then, though, she was my sun, my moon, my everything. She had this way about her: soft laughter that carried through the house, eyes that sparkled even when there wasn't much to smile about. We weren't rich, but we didn't need to be. Our love, or so I thought, was enough. Every morning, I'd wake before dawn to tend to the fields behind our cottage. The soil was stubborn, but it gave back if you worked hard enough. Clara would always have breakfast ready by the time I came inside, wiping sweat from my brow. "You work too hard," she'd say, placing a hand on my shoulder. And I'd laugh, brushing off her concern because what else could I do? A man provides. That's what I told myself every day. The neighbor, Jacob, the woodcutter, lived a stone's throw away. He wasn't someone I paid much attention to at first. He kept to himself, chopping logs and stacking them neatly outside his cabin. Occasionally, he'd nod at me as I passed by, hauling tools or carrying water from the well. Polite, distant, unremarkable. Or so I thought. Looking back now, I see the cracks were there all along. Tiny fissures in the foundation of our marriage that I chose to ignore. Clara began spending more time outdoors, tending to flowers she suddenly decided needed extra care near the fence. The same fence that bordered Jacob's property. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? She loved gardening. It made her happy. But happiness turned into something else entirely. An unease that crept into my chest like ivy climbing a tree. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky orange and pink, Clara sat across from me at dinner. Her fork hovered over her plate, untouched. "Is something wrong?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She shook her head quickly, forcing a smile. No, just tired." Tired. That word became her shield, her excuse, her lie. And yet, despite the growing weight in my gut, I said nothing. I convinced myself I was overthinking things. After all, why would Clara betray me? We had built this life together, brick by brick. How could she possibly look at another man? But fate has a cruel sense of humor. It waits until you're lulled into complacency, until you believe your world is safe, and then, bam, it pulls the rug out from under you. Little did I know, the betrayal was already taking root, hidden beneath layers of smiles and silence. And soon, I would find out just how deep it went. The days grew shorter as autumn settled over the village, painting the trees in hues of gold and crimson. It was a season I usually loved, the crisp air, the smell of fallen leaves. But this year, something felt off. There was an invisible tension threading through my days, tightening with each passing moment. And Jacob, the woodcutter, seemed to be at the center of it. At first, his presence wasn't alarming. He'd stop by occasionally, always under the guise of borrowing or returning something trivial: a hammer, a bucket, a sack of nails. Clara would greet him warmly, offering tea or a slice of bread if he lingered too long. "Such a kind neighbor," she'd say after he left, her tone light but distant. I nodded along, pretending not to notice how often those visits happened, or how her cheeks flushed ever so slightly when she spoke to him. It wasn't just the visits, though. It was the way Clara started humming unfamiliar tunes while working around the house. Songs I didn't recognize, songs that sounded older, earthier, like they belonged to someone else's life. When I asked where she'd heard them, she shrugged and said, "Oh, I don't know. Maybe from the market?" But we hadn't been to the market in weeks. Then there were the nights. Nights when sleep eluded me, and I'd lie awake listening to the faint creak of floorboards as Clara moved about the house. Sometimes, I'd hear her whispering softly to herself, though I could never make out the words. Other times, I'd catch glimpses of her standing by the window, staring into the darkness toward Jacob's cabin. She'd turn quickly whenever I stirred, feigning surprise at being caught. "Why are you up?" she'd ask, her voice tinged with guilt. Or maybe it was just my imagination. I couldn't sleep, I'd reply, watching her carefully, but she'd avoid my gaze, busying herself with some meaningless task until I gave up and closed my eyes again. One afternoon, as I worked in the fields, I noticed Jacob chopping wood near the fence line. His movements were steady, deliberate, almost rhythmic. Clara was on our side of the fence, pruning roses that didn't need pruning. They weren't speaking, not that I could hear, anyway, but their proximity made my skin crawl. Every swing of his axe felt like a drumbeat marking time towards something inevitable. "Clara!" I called out, louder than necessary. She startled, dropping her shears. "What are you doing out here?" She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "Just tidying up," she said, forcing a smile. These bushes were getting wild. "They look fine to me," I muttered, narrowing my eyes at Jacob. He paused mid-swing, meeting my stare for a brief second before resuming his work. There was no malice in his expression, no sign of guilt, just calm indifference. That bothered me more than anything. Later that evening, as we sat together by the fire, I tried to broach the subject. "You've been spending a lot of time near the fence lately," I said casually, poking at the embers with a stick. Clara stiffened, though only for a moment. "Is that a crime now?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut. Then, softening, she added, "I'm just trying to keep things nice. Is that such a bad thing?" "No," I replied, shaking my head. "No, it's not." But the words tasted bitter on my tongue. I wanted to press further, to demand answers, but fear held me back. Fear of what I might uncover. So instead, I let it go, burying my suspicions deep inside where they festered like an untreated wound. Days turned into weeks, and still, the unease lingered. One morning, as I prepared to head into town to sell some of our harvest, Clara handed me a basket filled with fresh-baked bread and jars of honey. "Take these," she urged. "They'll fetch a good price." I hesitated, studying her face. Was this another distraction? Another attempt to keep me occupied while she did whatever it was she was doing? But I took the basket without argument, kissed her cheek, and set off down the winding path toward the market. As I walked, my mind raced. What was I missing? Why did everything feel so wrong? By the time I reached the edge of the woods, I realized I'd forgotten my coin purse. Cursing under my breath, I turned back, retracing my steps toward home. And that's when I saw it. Through the trees, barely visible from the path, I caught sight of Clara and Jacob standing close together near the fence. Too close. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, and though their voices were low, the intimacy between them was unmistakable. My heart sank like a stone thrown into a lake, sending ripples of anger and betrayal coursing through me. For a moment, I stood frozen, unable to move or breathe. Then, slowly, deliberately, I stepped back into the shadows, hiding myself from view. I didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, I watched, memorizing every detail, every gesture, every wordless exchange. Because I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I don't remember how long I stood there, hidden among the trees, watching Clara and Jacob. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second heavier than the last. My chest tightened, my breath shallow, as if the air itself had turned to stone. I wanted to scream, to storm out and demand answers, but something held me back, a mixture of disbelief and dread that rooted me to the spot. Clara laughed softly at something Jacob said, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear. It wasn't the warm, carefree laugh I knew. It was different, lighter, almost flirtatious. The sound clawed at my insides, leaving raw wounds in its wake. Jacob smiled in response, his hand brushing against hers as they parted ways. That small, fleeting touch felt like a dagger twisting in my gut. When they finally separated, Clara heading back toward the house and Jacob retreating to his cabin, I forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead, every step an effort, but I managed to stumble back onto the path without being seen. By the time I reached the cottage, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, confusion, and a crushing sense of loss that made it hard to breathe. Clara was inside, humming one of those unfamiliar tunes again. She looked up when I entered, her expression brightening momentarily before faltering at the sight of me. "You're back already?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise and something else. Guilt? Fear? I couldn't tell. "I forgot my coin purse," I said flatly, my voice devoid of emotion. I didn't trust myself to say more. Not yet. Instead, I retrieved the purse from the table and turned to leave, avoiding her gaze. But as I reached the door, I stopped, unable to resist asking the question burning in my throat. "Why were you talking to Jacob?" The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Clara froze, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. For a moment, she didn't speak, and I thought she might deny it altogether. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping as though releasing a weight she'd been carrying for too long. "He's just a neighbor, Elias," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "We were discussing the fence. It needs repairs." "The fence," I repeated, my tone icy. "Is that all?" Her hesitation was answer enough. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she shook her head. "Please, Elias, don't make this harder than it has to be." "Harder? Harder?" The rage bubbling inside me threatened to boil over, but I clenched my fists until my nails dug into my palms, forcing myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time or place for confrontation. Not yet. I needed proof. Solid, undeniable evidence that would confirm what I already suspected. "I'm going to the market," I said stiffly, turning away before she could see the storm brewing in my eyes. "Don't wait up." The walk to town was agony. Each step felt like dragging chains behind me, the weight of what I'd witnessed pressing down on my chest. My thoughts raced, replaying the scene over and over again. Had I imagined it? Was I jumping to conclusions? No. Deep down, I knew the truth. Clara had betrayed me. With him. With Jacob. By the time I reached the market, my resolve had hardened into something cold and unyielding. I sold the bread and honey quickly, barely registering the coins exchanged or the faces of the villagers around me. All I could think about was uncovering the full extent of Clara's deceit, and I knew exactly where to start. On my way home, I detoured through the woods, taking a narrow trail that led to Jacob's cabin. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, signaling he was inside. My pulse quickened as I approached, my heart pounding like a war drum. I knocked sharply on the door, my knuckles rapping against the wood with deliberate force. Jacob answered after a moment, his expression neutral but wary. "Elias," he said, nodding in greeting, "what brings you here?" "I need to talk to you," I replied, my voice low and steady despite the turmoil raging within me. "About Clara." His eyes flickered briefly, betraying a flash of unease, but he masked it quickly. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. The interior of the cabin was sparse but tidy, the scent of freshly cut wood lingering in the air. I scanned the room, searching for anything that might confirm my suspicions. And then I saw it. A scarf draped casually over the back of a chair. A scarf I recognized instantly. It belonged to Clara. My vision blurred with fury as I picked it up, holding it out to Jacob like an accusation. "Explain this," I demanded, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. Jacob hesitated, his jaw tightening. Then, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. "You deserve the truth," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But not here. Not like this." "Then where?" I snapped, my patience fraying. "When?" He glanced toward the window, as if weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. "Meet me tonight, at the old mill by the river. I'll tell you everything. Everything." The word echoed in my mind, hollow and ominous. What more could there possibly be? Yet I agreed, knowing I had no choice. If I wanted answers, if I wanted justice, I had to hear him out. As I left the cabin, the scarf clutched tightly in my fist, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that the truth was finally within reach, and dread at what it might reveal. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. This betrayal would not go unpunished. The old mill stood like a ghost at the edge of the river, its weathered wooden beams sagging under the weight of time. It had been abandoned for years, its once busy wheels now silent and still. As I approached that night, the moonlight casting long shadows across the landscape, I couldn't help but feel as though the mill itself was watching me, waiting, just as I was. I arrived early, pacing along the bank to steady my nerves. My mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. What would Jacob say? How far had this betrayal gone? And what would I do when I finally knew the truth? The scarf I'd found in his cabin burned in my pocket, a tangible reminder of Clara's infidelity. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, as if the ground beneath me were conspiring to slow my progress. When Jacob appeared, he moved cautiously, his silhouette emerging from the darkness like a shadow come to life. He carried no lantern, relying instead on the pale glow of the moon to guide him. His face was unreadable, his expression guarded. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, two men bound by secrets neither of us wanted to confront. "You came," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, almost resigned, but there was an undercurrent of tension that matched my own. "I said I would," I replied coldly, gripping the scarf tighter in my hand. "Now talk." Jacob sighed, running a hand through his hair. He glanced around as if searching for something, perhaps courage, perhaps escape, but found neither. Finally, he nodded and began to speak. "It started innocently enough," he admitted, his words measured but tinged with regret. "She came to me one day, asking for help with the fence. Said you were busy with the fields and she didn't want to bother you. At first, it was just neighborly, friendly." He paused, swallowing hard. "But then what?" I demanded, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. My patience was slipping, fraying like rope pulled too tight. Jacob hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. Then it became more. Conversations turned into confessions. Confessions turned into something neither of us intended. My fists clenched so tightly my nails drew blood, but I barely noticed. "You mean betrayal," I spat, taking a step closer. "You stole her from me." "No." Jacob shot back, his tone rising for the first time. "It wasn't like that. She wasn't happy, Elias. You have to understand. Don't you dare tell me about my wife." I roared, cutting him off. My anger surged forward, unchecked and raw. "You think I don't see how you've poisoned her against me? How you've twisted her loyalty?" "I didn't twist anything," Jacob insisted, his voice shaking now. "She came to me because she needed someone who listened, someone who cared. Can you honestly say you've done that lately?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me momentarily breathless. Was he right? Had I failed Clara somehow? No, I refused to believe it. This wasn't about me, it was about him, about them. "Enough," I growled, stepping closer until we were nearly nose to nose. "Tell me everything. Leave nothing out." Jacob exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he muttered, "but you won't like it." And so he told me. He recounted every stolen moment, every whispered conversation, every lie they'd told to cover their tracks. They'd met late at night when they thought I was asleep, sneaking through the woods like thieves in the dark. They laughed together, shared dreams I never knew Clara had, built a connection I hadn't realized was missing. Each revelation felt like another nail driven into my coffin, sealing away the life I thought I'd known. By the time he finished, my hands were trembling, not with rage anymore, but with something colder, something darker. Betrayal isn't just pain, it's emptiness, a void where trust used to be. And as I stood there listening to Jacob's confession, I felt that void opening wider with every word. When he was done, he looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for forgiveness or absolution, but I gave him neither. Instead, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone by the river. As I made my way home, my thoughts churned like the water rushing over the rocks. I couldn't unhear what I'd learned, couldn't unsee the image of Clara laughing with him, leaning into his touch. But even worse was the realization that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was mine, about making sure neither of them ever forgot what they'd taken from me. By the time I reached the cottage, The first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. Clara was asleep in bed, her breathing soft and steady. For a moment, I stood in the doorway, watching her, letting the weight of everything settle over me. Then, quietly, I closed the door behind me and began to plan. Because betrayal demands consequences, and I intended to make sure they paid. The days that followed were a blur of cold calculation and restless nights. I moved through the motions of my life, tending to the fields, preparing meals, speaking only when necessary. But inside, my mind was a storm. Every action, every word, every glance at Clara was deliberate, measured. I wore a mask of normalcy, careful not to let her see the rage simmering beneath the surface. She had no idea what I knew, no idea what I was planning. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Clara seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn. She avoided my gaze during meals, her hands fidgeting nervously as if she sensed something was wrong. Occasionally, she'd try to engage me in conversation, asking about the crops or commenting on the weather, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. It was as though she were testing the waters, probing for signs of suspicion. I gave her none. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked one evening as we sat by the fire. Her tone was soft, almost hesitant, like she was walking on eggshells. "I'm fine," I replied curtly, keeping my eyes fixed on the flames. "Why wouldn't I be?" She hesitated, then shrugged, retreating into silence. I could feel her watching me, searching for cracks in my facade, but I remained still as stone. Let her wonder. Let her worry. At night, when she thought I was asleep, I listened to her movements, the creak of floorboards, the faint rustle of fabric as she paced near the window. Once, I heard her whisper Jacob's name in her sleep. Just once. But it was enough. Enough to fuel the fire burning inside me. Enough to remind me why I couldn't stop now. I spent hours in the workshop behind the house, crafting tools I hadn't touched in years. A saw, a hatchet, nails, rope, all things I told myself I needed for repairs around the property. Clara didn't question it. She never ventured into the workshop anymore. To her, it was just another part of my routine, another distraction to keep me occupied while she carried on with her lies. But these weren't ordinary tools. They were instruments of justice, instruments of revenge. Every swing of the hammer, every stroke of the file, brought me closer to the moment I'd been waiting for. I imagined their faces, Clara's wide-eyed shock, Jacob's panicked realization, as they finally understood the depth of my anger. My resolve hardened with each passing day, until there was nothing left of the man I used to be. Only this new version remained, cold, calculating, unyielding. One afternoon, as I worked in the fields, I noticed Jacob chopping wood near the fence again. He glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting mine, and I saw the flicker of unease cross his face. Good. Let him wonder. Let him fear. I nodded curtly before turning back to my work, pretending not to care. Inside, though, I was already several steps ahead. That evening, I made my move. After dinner, I announced that I'd be heading into town the next morning to sell some of our harvest. "It'll take most of the day," I said casually, sipping tea as Clara cleared the dishes. "Don't wait up." She paused mid-motion, her back to me. "You're leaving tomorrow?" she asked, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Relief? Anxiety? "Yes," I replied, setting the cup down with deliberate slowness. "Is that a problem?" "No, no," she said quickly, forcing a smile as she turned to face me. "Just surprised, that's all." "Good," I said, rising from the table. "I'll need an early start." As I retired to bed that night, I lay awake, listening to Clara's restless movements. She crept out of the room shortly after I pretended to fall asleep, likely heading to the window to watch for Jacob. I waited until her breathing steadied before slipping out of bed, gathering the items I'd prepared earlier. By dawn, everything was in place. I hitched the cart to the horse and loaded it with produce, ensuring it looked convincing enough for anyone who might see me leave. Then, instead of heading toward town, I circled back through the woods, taking a hidden path that led to the old mill. From there, I would wait, hidden among the trees, until Clara and Jacob inevitably met. And they did. I watched them approach the mill together, their steps cautious but unhurried. Clara glanced over her shoulder frequently, scanning the area for any sign of me. Jacob held her hand, murmuring reassurances I couldn't hear but could easily imagine. They thought they were safe. They thought I was miles away. They were wrong. When they entered the mill, I stepped out from the shadows, moving silently until I was close enough to make my presence known. The look on their faces when they saw me, Clara's gasp of shock, Jacob's instinctive step forward to shield her, was worth every sleepless night, every ounce of pain they'd caused. "You didn't think I'd find out?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "You didn't think I'd come for you?" Clara stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. "Elias, please." "Please what?" I snapped, cutting her off. "Please forgive you? Forgive him? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Jacob stepped forward, his expression grim. "This isn't her fault," he said firmly. "If you want someone to blame, blame me." "Oh, I do," I replied, my lips curling into a bitter smile. "Believe me, I do." For a moment, no one spoke. The air between us crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on. Then, slowly, I reached into my coat and pulled out the scarf, the same scarf I'd found in Jacob's cabin. Clara's eyes widened as I held it up, letting it dangle from my fingers like a trophy. "This ends tonight," I said, my voice colder than the winter wind. "Both of you will pay for what you've done." And with that, I began to execute the plan I'd spent weeks perfecting. A plan designed not just to punish, but to ensure they would never forget the cost of betrayal. The mill creaked and groaned around us, its ancient timbers straining under the weight of our collective tension. Clara clung to Jacob, her wide eyes darting between him and me as if searching for some way out of this nightmare. But there was none. I had planned every detail meticulously, leaving no room for escape. "This doesn't have to end badly," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the fear flickering in his eyes. He held up his hands in a gesture of surrender, trying to reason with me. "We can talk about this, Elias. Find a way to." "There's nothing to talk about," I interrupted, my tone icy. My grip tightened on the hatchet I'd brought with me, the tool glinting faintly in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. "You took something that wasn't yours. Now you'll face the consequences." Clara whimpered, her body trembling against Jacob's side. "Elias, please, don't do this," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." "Sorry?" I echoed, my voice rising sharply. "Sorry isn't enough. You lied to me, Clara. You betrayed me." "And him?" I pointed the hatchet at Jacob, my hand shaking with barely contained fury. "He knew exactly what he was doing. He stole you from me." Jacob stepped forward, positioning himself protectively in front of Clara. "If you're going to hurt anyone, hurt me," he said firmly. "Leave her out of this." "Oh, don't worry," I sneered, circling them slowly like a predator sizing up its prey. "You'll both get what's coming to you." With that, I moved toward the center of the mill, where ropes hung loosely from the rafters above. Earlier that morning, I had rigged the space with traps designed to ensnare them, simple yet effective contraptions meant to hold them captive while I delivered my judgment. I gestured toward the far corner of the room, where shadows concealed the first of these devices. "Over there," I commanded, pointing with the hatchet. "Move." They hesitated, exchanging a glance filled with desperation. For a moment, I thought they might resist, but then Jacob nodded slightly, urging Clara to comply. Together, they shuffled toward the spot I indicated, their movements cautious and uncertain. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the trap sprang into action. A hidden tripwire snapped taut, yanking a length of rope tight around Jacob's ankles and jerking him off his feet. He cried out as he crashed to the ground, the force of the fall knocking the wind from his lungs. Clara screamed, dropping to her knees beside him, but before she could react further, another mechanism triggered, a net cascading down from above, tangling her limbs and pinning her to the floor. "No!" she shrieked, thrashing wildly against the coarse fibers binding her. "Let us go." I stood over them, watching dispassionately as they struggled futilely against their restraints. The sight of their helplessness should have satisfied me, It almost did, but instead, it only deepened the void inside me. This wasn't joy or triumph. It was emptiness. A hollow victory born of betrayal. You wanted freedom, I said quietly, kneeling beside Clara. She flinched as I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her tear-streaked face. You chose him over me. Now you'll see what happens when you break your vows. She shook her head violently, sobbing uncontrollably. Please, Elias. I love you. I still love you. Her words struck me like a hammer blow, shattering whatever fragile composure I'd managed to maintain. Love? How dare she speak of love now? After everything? Rage surged within me, threatening to consume what little humanity remained. Love? I spat, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look at me. You don't know the meaning of the word. Behind me, Jacob groaned, struggling weakly against the rope binding his legs. Stop this, he rasped, his voice strained. You've made your point. Let her go. I turned to him, my expression cold and unyielding. My point? I repeated, laughing bitterly. Oh, we're just getting started. I left them there, bound and helpless, while I retrieved the final pieces of my plan. From a satchel I'd stashed earlier, I pulled out a small vial containing a clear liquid, a sedative strong enough to render someone unconscious for hours. It wasn't lethal, but it would ensure neither of them could interfere with what came next. Kneeling beside Jacob first, I uncorked the vial and pressed it to his lips. Drink, I ordered, tilting his head back. When he resisted, I forced his jaw open, pouring the liquid down his throat. He choked and sputtered, but eventually swallowed, his struggles growing weaker by the second. Within moments, his eyelids drooped, and he slumped limply against the ropes. Clara watched in horror, screaming and pleading as I approached her next. No, please, don't hurt him, she begged, writhing desperately in the net. But her protests fell on deaf ears. I repeated the process with her, holding her head steady as I administered the drug. Her cries softened into whimpers, her body going slack as the sedative took effect. When they were both unconscious, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. The adrenaline coursing through my veins began to ebb, leaving behind a strange numbness. What now? I had them trapped, vulnerable, completely at my mercy. But revenge wasn't enough. Not anymore. I needed something more permanent, something irrevocable. An idea formed in my mind, dark and cruel, yet undeniably fitting. They had chosen each other over me. They had built a life together in secret, stealing moments I thought belonged solely to me. Now, they would share one final moment, one that would bind them forever. I dragged Jacob to the center of the mill, tying his wrists securely to a wooden beam. Then, using the same rope, I secured Clara to him, binding them back to back so they couldn't move. Their heads lolled against each other, their faces pale and lifeless in sleep. To anyone who found them later, it would look like they had died together, an eternal embrace forged by fate. But I wasn't done yet. From my satchel, I produced a lantern and a bundle of dry kindling. Placing the wood strategically around the base of the beam, I lit the lantern and set it carefully among the tinder. Flames licked hungrily at the dry material, spreading quickly as the fire grew. Smoke began to fill the air, curling upward like ghostly tendrils. I stepped back, watching as the fire engulfed the lower half of the mill. It wouldn't take long for the structure to collapse entirely, burying them beneath burning debris. By the time anyone discovered what had happened, there would be nothing left but ash. And me? I would vanish, disappear into the wilderness, leaving behind no trace of the man I once was. As the flames roared higher, consuming the old mill with terrifying speed, I retreated into the woods, my heart pounding in time with the crackling inferno behind me. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of physical exhaustion, but because of the weight of what I'd done. Betrayal had driven me to this point, to madness, to cruelty. But now that it was over, I felt nothing. Hollow, empty. The forest was eerily quiet, as if even nature itself recoiled from the violence I'd unleashed. Shadows danced across the trees, cast by the firelight that illuminated the night sky. Villagers would surely notice the blaze soon enough, rushing to put it out, but by then, it would be too late. The mill, and everyone inside it, would be gone. I moved swiftly, sticking to narrow paths and avoiding main roads. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, set my nerves on edge, making me hyper-aware of my surroundings. Paranoia gnawed at me, whispering doubts and fears I tried to ignore. Had I covered my tracks well enough? Would they find me? By dawn, I reached the edge of the village, where I'd stashed a small pack containing supplies, dried food, a water skin, a map of the surrounding region. I changed clothes, discarding the ones I'd worn during the fire, and buried them deep in the earth. No evidence, no trail, just a man disappearing into the wild. For days, I traveled alone, pushing myself farther and farther from the life I'd destroyed. Hunger and fatigue became constant companions, but I welcomed the discomfort. Pain was preferable to the memories haunting me. The look in Clara's eyes as she begged for mercy, the sound of Jacob's voice as he tried to shield her. Those images replayed endlessly in my mind, taunting me, reminding me of the monster I'd become. Eventually, I reached a remote cabin nestled deep in the mountains, far from any settlement. It was abandoned, its roof sagging and its windows boarded up, but it provided shelter. Inside, I found remnants of a previous occupant. He carried a rifle slung over his shoulder and moved with the confidence of someone familiar with the wilderness. When he saw me, he stopped, studying me with sharp, calculating eyes. "You're not from around here," he said finally, his voice gruff but not unkind. "No," I replied, standing cautiously. "I'm passing through." He nodded, though skepticism lingered in his gaze. "This area's dangerous for strangers, especially in winter. You got supplies?" "Enough," I muttered, avoiding his scrutiny. Something about him unsettled me, not because he posed a threat, but because he reminded me of myself before everything went wrong, before the fire, before the betrayal. The stranger introduced himself as Matthias, a hunter who lived in a nearby valley. He explained that he'd been tracking game when he stumbled upon my cabin. "Figured I'd check it out," he said with a shrug. "Place looked abandoned till I saw smoke." We talked briefly, exchanging pleasantries and sharing bits of food. Matthias seemed harmless enough, but there was a depth to him, an understanding of pain and loss, that intrigued me. Over the course of several visits, he shared stories of his own struggles, a failed marriage, a daughter he rarely saw, a life spent running from mistakes he couldn't undo. Listening to him, I realized I wasn't alone in carrying burdens too heavy to bear. Yet unlike me, Matthias sought redemption rather than revenge. He spoke of forgiveness, not for others, but for himself, and of finding peace in the present rather than dwelling on the past. His words stirred something in me, a flicker of hope I hadn't felt in months. Maybe there was a way to move forward, to let go of the anger and hatred that had consumed me. But how? How could I ever forgive Clara and Jacob for what they'd done? How could I forgive myself for what I'd become? Matthias didn't offer answers. He simply listened, nodding occasionally as I poured out my story. When I finished, he placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch firm but gentle. "You can't change the past," he said quietly, "but you can choose what comes next." Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow and bringing new life to the mountains. With it came a shift within me, a tentative acceptance of Matthias's advice. I couldn't erase the scars of my actions, nor could I undo the lives I'd destroyed. But perhaps I could find a way to live with them, to honor the man I used to be, even if I could never fully reclaim him. I decided to leave the cabin, to venture beyond the mountains and start anew. Matthias offered to accompany me part way, guiding me through treacherous terrain until I reached safer ground. Along the journey, we spoke often, sharing stories and lessons learned. His presence was a balm to my weary soul, a reminder that healing was possible, even for someone like me. When we parted ways, he handed me a small journal. "Write it down," he urged. "Your thoughts, your regrets, your hopes. It helps." At first, I resisted, unsure of how putting pen to paper could ease the weight I carried. But as the days turned into weeks, I found solace in writing. Each entry was a step toward understanding, a piece of the puzzle that was my shattered self. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild. I eventually settled in a distant town, taking on odd jobs and keeping to myself. The villagers were kind but respectful of my privacy, sensing that I preferred solitude. In time, I earned their trust, becoming a reliable member of the community. Though I never spoke of my past, I carried it with me always, a reminder of the cost of betrayal and the power of forgiveness. One day, while walking through the market, I overheard a child singing a familiar tune. It stopped me in my tracks, the melody stirring memories I'd worked so hard to bury. For a moment, I froze, overwhelmed by emotion. Then, taking a deep breath, I smiled faintly and continued on my way. Life goes on. People change. And though I will never forget the choices I made, I've come to realize that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning to live with it. And for the first time in years, I feel at peace.